After many years of loneliness, when Jacob lost everything, 3 mysterious women offered him a new life. He could not have imagined that their beauty and care were only a part of a cruel plan of revenge for past events that had no relation to him. But when his ranch was about to be lost forever, fate, in the person of one man, gave him a second chance. Look inside to find out what a shocking denouement this drama had and why justice, in the end, prevailed. At the end, an important conclusion awaits you, which will teach you wisdom and make you think. Be sure to subscribe and like, so as not to miss this story, because its plot will shock you to the core. The Wild Horse Ranch was the embodiment of loneliness. In 1883, in the endless expanses of Arizona, it belonged to Jacob McKenna, a strong and taciturn man of about 40. His face, etched with wrinkles from the sun and wind, bore the imprint of long years of hard work and, what was much more noticeable, deep sorrow. Jacob became a widower 10 years ago, losing his wife and newborn son during an epidemic. Since then, his life had turned into a routine: sunrise, work, sunset, whiskey, silence. He was the only person on the ranch, not counting a dozen cowboys who came and went, driving cattle. One day, at the end of a hot day, a dusty stagecoach pulled up to the ranch. It shouldn't have been here, as the main road was miles away. 3 women came out of it, and Jacob froze, leaning on the corral fence. It was a surprise bordering on disbelief. In the wilderness, where even tumbleweeds seemed to be a rarity, 3 embodiments of female beauty stood before him. The first was Elizabeth. Her red hair, braided into tight plaits, shimmered in the sun, and her emerald eyes seemed to reflect the color of all the greenery that had ever existed on this earth. She wore a simple, but elegant traveling dress that emphasized her stately, proud posture. She looked at Jacob with a smile full of confidence. Next came Sarah. Her hair was the color of ripe wheat, and her eyes were as deep and bottomless blue as the summer sky over the prairies. She was smaller in stature than Elizabeth, but her tenderness and fragility did not hide an inner strength. She didn't smile, but only slightly lowered her gaze, as if she were shy, which gave her even more charm. The third was Rebecca. She had raven black hair, pulled up into a high bun, and her eyes were the color of dark coffee. Her facial features were sharp, strong-willed, and she carried herself with unconcealed authority. She wore a strict black dress that only emphasized her paleness. All 3 of them got out of the stagecoach, and Jacob felt as if his scorching prairies had suddenly found themselves at the foot of a snow-covered mountain. The air became different, more saturated, moist. The man,
I ask you to like and subscribe to the channel, so you will help me in motivation to make such great stories for you, and I will see that you like them. Enjoy watching, everyone.
accustomed to simple communication with cowboys, was speechless. Elizabeth stepped forward and spoke first. Her voice was melodious and pure, like spring water. "Are you Jacob McKenna?" she asked. Jacob nodded, unable to utter a word. "We were looking for you. We are sisters, and we came to offer you something that you may not have dreamed of. We will be your wives." The shock from this statement was so strong that Jacob almost dropped his mug. The women, in whose eyes he saw not only beauty, but also something inexplicable, stood before him like messengers from another world. This moment of surprise was only the beginning. It was followed by admiration. 3 sisters, 3 different characters, 3 promises. Elizabeth, with her open smile and sincere gaze, immediately took on the role of the mistress. She knew how to manage things like no one else, and her presence in the house breathed new life into it. She brought seeds that Jacob had never seen, and within a few days, a small plot of land that he had long considered barren began to come to life. Elizabeth didn't just command, she worked, not afraid to get her hands dirty, and her determination was admirable. Sarah turned out to be the complete opposite. She was quiet and caring. Her hands, so tender and fragile in appearance, could prepare a dinner that would make any cowboy forget about rudeness. She sewed, mended clothes, sang old ballads, and her voice, as gentle as silk, filled the house with coziness and warmth. Sarah knew how to approach even the most sullen workers, and those who used to shy away from Jacob now gravitated toward her for advice or just for a word. She was the embodiment of the hearth that the ranch had lacked for so long. Rebecca, however, was a mystery. She spoke little, preferring to observe. Her gaze, sharp and penetrating, seemed to see not only what was on the surface, but also what was hidden in the depths of the soul. Rebecca understood horses better than any of the cowboys, and her calm confidence inspired respect. She could pacify the most skittish stallion in a few minutes, and her skill evoked not only admiration, but also a slight fear. Jacob felt that something more than just knowledge of the matter was hidden behind her cold manner. She seemed to see right through him, and this thought was troubling. For the first time in 10 years, Jacob felt himself not just the owner of a ranch, but the head of a family. Life at Wild Horse was transformed. The ranch began to prosper. The cattle were gaining weight, the harvest was unprecedented, and the house always smelled of fresh baked goods. The cowboys, who used to see in him only a stern boss, now began to respect him as a man who was able to attract such amazing women. Jacob was surrounded by care and attention. Elizabeth discussed plans for the future with him. Sarah quietly left his favorite whiskey on the table, and Rebecca was just there, like a shadow, but her presence was felt as a powerful support. Each of them brought into his life what he had been missing for so long, and he gradually began to succumb to this admiration. His loneliness receded, replaced by a feeling of fullness and joy. But sometimes, in the silence of the night, he noticed that these three women, so different during the day, sometimes gathered together and held long, quiet conversations. Their words were barely audible, and he could not make out what they were talking about. At such moments, a slight fear crept up on him again. It was not a fear of the women. It was the fear that all of this was too good to be true, that this heavenly corner would have to be paid for with too high a price. And although his mind told him to enjoy the moment, instinct told him that this peace was just the calm before the storm. This storm came in the form of a stranger who pulled up to the ranch one evening. He was old, his horse's saddle was well worn, and his gaze was heavy and tired. He asked for water and wondered where he could find Jacob McKenna. "I'm Jacob," the ranch owner replied. The stranger, who called himself Old Jim, did not take his eyes off him. "Are you the same Jacob who lost his wife and son?" he asked. "Yes," Jacob replied, feeling his heart contract. Old Jim looked around the ranch as if he was looking for something, and then his gaze stopped at Elizabeth, Sarah, and Rebecca, who came out onto the porch. His eyes widened in horror. He covered his mouth with his hand, as if trying to hold back a scream. "What is it, old man?" Jacob asked, feeling a chill seep into his soul. Jim, without answering, jumped into the saddle and, lashing his horse, rode off into the sunset, as if he was being chased by ghosts. Jacob turned to the women. Their faces were pale, and their smiles were gone. Elizabeth, always so confident, now looked frightened. Rebecca looked at the receding figure with unconcealed hostility, and only Sarah, with her eternally calm face, walked up to Jacob and took his hand. "Pay no attention," she said quietly. "The old man must have just been scared." But Jacob knew that wasn't true. He saw the fear in his eyes. And it was not just fear. It was horror. And it was connected with him, with his past and with these three women. This became the first crack in his ideal life, the first sign that his admiration was just an illusion, that something much darker and more frightening was hidden behind it. After the mysterious disappearance of Old Jim, a tense silence reigned on the ranch. Elizabeth, always so open and cheerful, began to avoid Jacob, spending more time in the stable with Rebecca. Sarah, on the contrary, was even more affectionate than before, but in her eyes, when she looked at Jacob, there was now tenderness mixed with some hidden sadness. The slight fear that had previously been only a shadow now became palpable, permeating the air. Jacob noticed other oddities as well. One evening, when he was checking the fence, he saw Elizabeth talking to a stranger at the creek. The man was in a long dark cloak, and his face was hidden in the shadows. Jacob called out to her, but she just hastily turned around, nodded to the stranger, and he disappeared into the thicket. When she approached, Jacob asked who it was. "Just an old peddler, honey," she replied with a smile, but her eyes, usually so sincere, now seemed empty. Events began to accelerate. In a week, several cows went missing, the very ones that looked the healthiest. That same night, Jacob heard strange sounds from the barn. He went to check, but the door was locked. He saw light coming through the cracks and heard voices. They were the voices of Sarah and Rebecca. He listened. "He won't notice anything," Rebecca's voice said, full of arrogance. "He's too trusting," Sarah added, and there was no trace of her usual tenderness in her voice. Jacob retreated into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. What were they doing, and what were they hiding? The feeling of fear intensified, turning into a persistent, oppressive thought. The next morning, as Jacob was cleaning the stalls, his attention was drawn to an old, cracked saddle lying in the corner. It belonged to his late father. He picked it up and felt that it was too light. He ran his hand along the inside of the saddle and felt something inside. Tearing open the lining, he discovered a small bundle wrapped in yellowed parchment. Inside was a photograph. It showed 3 young girls, in wrinkled, old dresses. Underneath the photograph, written in pencil, was a word. Witches. He turned the photograph over and on the back side saw a drawn tree, where each of the branches was marked with a name. Elizabeth, Sarah, Rebecca. Under the tree it was written, "Dead souls, be careful." His hand trembled. His admiration for these women, who had brought light into his life, was now replaced by a deep, chilling fear. The stranger, old Jim, his words, their secret meetings, the strange sounds from the barn. Everything began to form a single terrifying picture. Elizabeth, Sarah, and Rebecca, it seemed, knew that he had found something. Their gazes, always directed at him, now seemed wary. For dinner, Elizabeth put a large pie on the table. "Eat, honey," she said. Her smile was strained. "You look tired." Jacob carefully refused. He felt an invisible knot tightening in his throat. He looked at Sarah. Her gentle features now seemed unfamiliar. He looked at Rebecca, who was staring at him, as if reading his mind. He got up, pushed his chair back, and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Elizabeth asked, her voice becoming hard. "I need to check on the horses," he lied. As soon as he left, he heard them talking loudly, but no longer in private, as if showing that they didn't care about his presence. "Hell, do it anyway. One way or another," Rebecca's voice said, full of malice. "We must hurry," Elizabeth added. Jacob immediately headed toward the canyon, where he usually drove some of the cattle. Thoughts raced through his head. What did they mean? What were they going to do? He felt the world he had built for so long crumbling. At this time, he saw a small group of people pulling up to the canyon. They didn't look like cowboys. Their wagon was overflowing with some tools, and Jacob hid behind a rock to eavesdrop. The men spoke quietly, but Jacob could hear. "Soon everything will be ready. When McKenna makes a decision, his cattle will be ours. And his ranch, too. They paid us to get rid of him." The stranger's words were like gunshots. Everything in Jacob's head fell into place. This was not just a shock, it was the realization that these women, whom he had let into his life, were actually his enemies. They did not bring happiness, they brought destruction. Their goal was not to become his wives, but to take everything he had. They had a conspiracy with some bandits. He ran back to the ranch, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to get a weapon, warn the cowboys. He burst into the house, but there was no one there. An envelope was on the table. Inside was a letter from Elizabeth, written in the same calligraphic hand as on the back of the photograph. "Jacob," the letter read, "we are not who we pretend to be. We are the heiresses of the land that you took from our family. Your father and grandfather killed our loved ones to get this canyon. We came not for you, but for what belongs to us, and we will get it back, whatever it costs us." Jacob lowered the letter, his hands trembling. It was a shock that he could not digest. Everything he thought was true was a lie. All the warmth, care, beauty, just an artfully woven web. The 3 women who were supposed to become his family were just vengeful shadows of the past. The happy moment he experienced turned into a real nightmare. The light in his life went out. He stood in the middle of the house that was full of their presence, but now it seemed empty, cold. The emotion of shock filled him, displacing all other feelings. He was in love with his enemies. He let them into his house, into his heart, and they just used him. It was not just betrayal, it was a cruel, merciless destruction of his life. His ranch, his house, his hopes, everything was under threat. And what did they do to old Jim? What will they do to him? Thoughts raced through his head, giving him no peace, and his soul, finally, felt that very inevitable sadness that had been waiting for him from the very beginning. Elizabeth's letter fell to the wooden floor, like a verdict. Jacob stood in the middle of his house, and the walls, which just yesterday were filled with warmth, now seemed cold and alien. He was robbed not just of cattle, not just of a ranch, he was robbed of hope. The feeling of shock was gradually replaced by a deep, all-consuming sadness. He was so blind, so naive. Memories of his deceased wife and son surfaced in his mind. He remembered how hard it was for him, after their passing, how he tried to heal the wounds, and then, when these 3 women appeared, it seemed to him that heaven had heard his prayers. He trusted them, opened his heart to them, and now it was torn to pieces. He was deceived, humiliated, And the most terrible thing was that he could not believe that those he trusted turned out to be his sworn enemies. He heard the horses neigh. Running outside, he saw that his cowboys, as if on command, were gathering in a crowd. One of them, old Jimmy, approached him with a puzzled expression on his face. "Boss, is something wrong?" he asked. "The ladies told us we could rest until they sorted things out." Jacob slowly looked up, his eyes full of sadness, at his men. "Go back to your homes," he said quietly. "There is nothing more for us to do here." Jimmy and the other cowboys, not understanding what was happening, simply obeyed. Jacob stood alone, watching his men leave like shadows. His house, his ranch, his life, all of it was collapsing before his eyes. At that moment, Elizabeth appeared from around the corner of the bar. Her face, usually so perfect, now seemed hard and merciless. "You read the letter," she said. And it was a statement, not a question. "You shouldn't have done that. Why did you do this?" Jacob asked, his voice trembling. Why did you enter my house, my life, and destroy everything?" "Your father, George McKenna, killed our family," she replied. "He came when we were still children and burned down our house. He took this land that your family calls Wild Horse, but for us, it is a cursed place. He thought we died in the fire, but we survived. 3 sisters who have since been hatching one plan: to come back and take what is ours. But I didn't know about it," Jacob replied, feeling his heart ache with pain. Elizabeth shook her head. "It doesn't matter. You are his blood, and we are revenge." She gestured to the approaching wagon. These were the same men he had seen in the canyon. "They will take everything you have, and then, when you stand alone, we will come and return to our land, which will now be ours again. This is our justice." Elizabeth's words were a cruel revelation. Jacob finally understood. Their love, their care, their smiles, all of this was part of a carefully thought-out plan to blind him, to disarm him. He was a pawn in their game, and his sadness grew into a feeling of complete hopelessness. He had neither the strength nor the weapon to oppose them. He was alone. At this moment, Sarah came out from behind the barn. Her eyes, usually so soft, were full of tears. "I didn't want this," she whispered, looking at Jacob. "I didn't want it to end this way." Elizabeth turned to her with anger. "What are you doing? Forget about him. We've been waiting for this for so many years." Rebecca also appeared from behind the barn. She held an old colt that belonged to Jacob in her hand. She held it out to him. "Take it," she said quietly. "I knew you weren't like them. Not like your father. I can't let it all end this way." Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock. "What are you doing, Rebecca?" she screamed, lunging at her sister. Rebecca pushed her away, but Elizabeth managed to snatch the colt from her hand. At the same time, the men from the wagon jumped to the ground, their guns aimed at Jacob. "He's ours," one of them said. "Well, deal with him." Jacob, standing between the 3 sisters and the bandits, realized that he was trapped. He was a victim. His whole life, his dreams, his aspirations, all of it became nothing. He was so close to happiness, to a new life, but this illusion collapsed. This sadness was heavier than 10 years of loneliness. Elizabeth aimed the colt at Jacob. Her hand trembled. "Get off my land," she hissed. "Otherwise, I'll do what I should have done a long time ago." But then Sarah intervened. She rushed forward, covering Jacob with her body. "No," she screamed. "Don't. He's not to blame." Elizabeth, unable to control her emotions, fired. But the bullet did not hit Jacob. It flew past, leaving only a slight mark on his cheek. At that moment, while Elizabeth was in confusion, Jacob instinctively grabbed a heavy stone lying at his feet and threw it at Elizabeth with a swing. She fell, dropping the pistol. The bandits, seeing that the situation was getting out of control, pounced on Jacob, but at that moment, 2 cowboys came out from behind the barn. Old Jimmy, who had not left, and his partner Sam. They quickly dealt with the bandits, twisting them and tying them up. They didn't leave. They had been watching the house all this time, sensing that something was wrong. Silence reigned on the ranch. The tied-up bandits lay on the ground. Elizabeth, stunned by the blow, was trying to regain her composure. Sarah and Rebecca, standing next to Jacob, looked at him with different expressions on their faces. Sarah, with relief. Rebecca, with admiration. Jacob looked at each of them, and now, when the illusion had collapsed, he saw in them not just beautiful women. He saw sisters who were broken by revenge, whom fate brought together with him, a man who turned out to be innocent. He saw their pain, their disappointment, their sadness. "I will not take revenge on you," he said quietly. "This ranch belongs to your family. It always belonged to you. I am giving it to you. Leave, and start your life over." Their eyes filled with sadness. They did not expect such an outcome. They expected a fight, hatred, but not compassion. They came to destroy his life, and he gave them his most valuable possession. This was not a triumph, not a victory. It was a catharsis, a liberation from the past. And it was this feeling, deep and piercing, that remained with him until they left, leaving him alone on the ranch that no longer belonged to him. And in this loneliness, he finally felt truly free. Jacob watched as the wagon with the three sisters and the tied-up bandits slowly drove away along the dusty road. The silence on the ranch was deafening. He stood alone, but in this silence there was not the former loneliness. There was only a feeling of sadness and liberation. He lost everything, but in return he gained something more valuable. He found himself. Jimmy and Sam walked up to him. "Boss, what should we do with these?" Jimmy asked, pointing at the bandits. "Take them to the sheriff in town," Jacob said. "Tell him they tried to rob the ranch. And then go home. I'm alone here." The cowboys exchanged surprised glances. "But what about you? Without cattle, without a home," Sam began. "It's okay," Jacob replied, and there was not a drop of bitterness in his voice. "This is no longer my home." "And that's right." The cowboys, without arguing, loaded the bandits onto the wagon and left. Jacob remained alone, and for the first time in many years, he felt peace. He sat on the porch and watched the sunset. The red sun slowly set behind the horizon, and the sky was painted in fiery shades. It was like the finale of a grandiose but cruel performance. In his life, he had experienced two great losses. The first was when he lost his wife and child. Then he locked his heart, giving up on the world. The second loss seemed more cruel. He lost everything he had, deceived by those he trusted. But this loss, paradoxically, brought him insight. He realized that his grief and loneliness had made him blind, ready to believe in any illusion of happiness. He longed for love and warmth so much that he didn't see the obvious signs of deception. He remembered Elizabeth's smile, her determination, which was actually a thirst for revenge. He remembered Sarah's tenderness, which in the end turned out to be an attempt to soften his heart to make him more vulnerable. He remembered Rebecca's mystery, who, as it turned out, was the only one who fought with her own conscience, trying to prevent the inevitable. All these qualities that he admired were only part of their mask, and this mask, like his hopes, was destroyed. Now before him was a complete, piercing sadness, the realization that the happiness he had experienced was a lie. But this sadness was healing. It gave him the opportunity to start from scratch, without the burden of the past. His house, his land, his life, all of it seemed to have disappeared. But what remained was his heart, which, having survived a second blow, only became stronger and wiser. He was no longer vulnerable to illusions, because he had learned their true nature. He got up, looked at the empty ranch, and turned to the empty expanses of the prairies. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do next, but he knew that he was free. Free from his past, from his grief, from his naivety. This finale was not a triumph, it was an acceptance that life is not always what it seems. An acceptance that even the most beautiful illusions can be the cruelest, and that after their collapse, one can find true, but sometimes bitter, freedom. This story, seemingly about the Wild West and revenge, in fact, deeply touches on feelings that are familiar to every person, especially those who have lived a long life. It contains an important lesson. Not always what seems ideal to us is so in reality. Sometimes people who bring light into our lives have their own dark goals. They can use our weaknesses, our longing for the past, to achieve their goals. Life is not always a fairy tale where a beautiful woman saves the hero. This story is about how important it is not to lose vigilance, how important it is to see people as they are, and not as we want to see them, especially for the older generation, who are so often victims of deception and fraud. This lesson is especially relevant. You need to learn to accept yourself and your past, and not look for false salvation in others' promises. True strength is not in having a large fortune or a ranch, but in finding inner peace and freedom, even after the most terrible losses. True happiness is not a beautiful illusion, but the ability to accept reality, no matter how bitter it may be, and to move on, knowing that your soul is free.